All right, so for everybody working on a additional focus area, we were going to talk a little bit about biodiversity today. First, I'm going to break down the three objectives that go with this additional focus area. We've got what biodiversity is and how it can be measured. So we'll talk about measurement just a little bit. We won't dive too deep into that. Um, we're also going to look at changes in the environment that can increase or decrease biodiversity, along with connecting changes in biodiversity to both human activity and our overall well-being. So first off, what is biodiversity? So figuring out of these two pictures, which is more biodiverse? Probably jumps at you pretty obviously that the lower right-hand corner picture is more biodiverse. There's more variety in both ages, sexes, and race. Similar here, a little bit furrier example, but you can tell that the upper left-hand corner picture has different breeds of dogs, not just one breed. And in the lower right-hand corner, we can see that now instead of just dogs, we've got different species of animals. So that also is more biodiverse. So what is it? It's variation within specifically an ecosystem is what we really care about the most in terms of biodiversity, even though we can extend that to other areas as well. So within that ecosystem, we have really high biodiversity if there's a bigger variety of different types of plants, animals, and organisms. We don't necessarily care about how many of each species there are, and that'll come up in the measurement in a little bit. We care about the differences in types of species, and the higher biodiversity. So looking at ecosystems, if we're comparing these two side by side, again, pretty obvious difference that the one on the right has a larger variety of plant species in it than the one on the left. For comparing these two food webs, we can see based on the variety of different organisms, the one on the right as well has a higher biodiversity than the one on the left. Now here's where we can get into the measurement component a little bit. So what's really important to note is that when you're measuring biodiversity, it's not just number of individuals. We care about the different types of species that there are. So even though there are more individuals in the top image, in the bottom, because there's two different species, that is actually more biodiverse. All right, so humans' role. What do we do and how does that affect biodiversity? So one great example we're going to work on here is logging, something really pertinent to the Midwest. A lot of logging historically in Wisconsin and Minnesota, not as much in Iowa, but still an issue, especially along the Mississippi River. So what kind of impact does that type of human change have on biodiversity? Well, if we think about a forest and we look at these groups of organisms that might live in that area, which one, if we come through and log, do you think is going to be affected the most? Okay, or have the best chance of survival. So most affected is least amount of biodiversity. And greater survival rate, greater survivability is definitely going to be the one with more biodiversity. Let's talk about why. Okay, so if we think about out of these two groups, these two potential forests, if three of those individuals are affected, right, there are only three available on the left. So if those three are all affected, there's no species left in that habitat. But if those same three are affected in the other one, then we still have survival. We still have species living there that are able to continue on. So there is still diversity there because of the greater variety of organisms. We can talk about the same thing here in this particular ecosystem. Again, pretty obvious which one's more biodiverse, the one with the greater variety of bear species. Now let's come back to that same logging example. Okay, if we have one species that's affected by the logging, then that one species is gone if that's all that's there. But if a couple of these species can handle being in an area that has less trees, they're likely to survive. We can bring that back to evolution and natural selection. They're the ones that would continue on in that area, pass on their genes, and eventually they might be most dominant in that area. Okay, so let's talk about some other examples. Obviously, logging is not the only thing that we do. Climate change can also have a huge impact on species and connect to biodiversity. So if we come back to our same bears, I think we all know that the polar bear is a classic example of species being affected by climate change. They're unlikely to survive that human event. However, the other bear species that are more adapted to a warmer climate are more likely to survive and maybe expand their range and be more common in places where they're not as common now. So is biodiversity a good thing? I hope at this point you're all saying, yes, yes, it's a great thing. It is. The more biodiverse of an area we have, the more likely that area is able to bounce back from disasters, whether they be natural disasters or human-caused events. Because it's likely, if we take a look at these organisms, it's likely someone or a group are able to survive that event. Maybe not everything, but at least some of them are likely to survive. So there'll still be species living in that area even after that event has occurred. All right, what else goes on? We've talked about deforestation, we've talked about climate change. Some other potential impacts are things like invasive species. So that's a species that doesn't belong in that area, got there somehow. Yes, usually it's because we brought them in either accidentally or intentionally. Anyone who does not like Japanese beetles, so our ladybug look-alike, that's an example of an invasive species. If you've heard about emerald ash borer killing ash trees, another example of an invasive species, both brought in by humans in an area where they didn't belong, and they don't have any natural predators, so there's nothing to control their population. Farming, huge in Iowa, right? Monoculture, so when you go and you see a farm field with nothing but corn, that is low biodiversity based on that definition. It is one plant species in an area. If you think about if a disease came in that affected only corn and only thing that we were growing was corn, that could have a huge impact to be really detrimental to that farmer. So that's another example of biodiversity and how it can be impacted. Pollution, urban sprawl is when humans spread out away from a city. So when you think of suburbs, that's an example of urban sprawl, human development, and all of these impact biodiversity because generally when you think about your house, your lawn is probably not very biodiverse. You have a couple different grass species. Well, if there was a prairie or a forest in that area before your house was built, that probably was more biodiverse. All right, why do we care about biodiversity? Why is it such a big issue? Well, we already talked about the fact that habitats that are more biodiverse can survive disasters more easily. Some species are likely to make it through. But there's a lot of other reasons why we want to keep a wide variety of plants and animals. Number one, a lot of medicines historically have been found from plants and animals in an area. So if we're losing some of those plants and animals, we might be losing medical cures that we didn't realize existed. A lot of natural materials, natural processes inspire technological advances. So a lot of architects will study how plants are structured to maintain strength and rigidity, and they can recreate that in buildings. They'll study behaviors and patterns in insects, and that can inspire them for technological advances as well. We can look at how plants capture energy from the sun and convert that into food, and that can be inspiration for technology. Without bacteria and fungi to decompose and recycle a lot of our waste materials, we'd be surrounded by garbage all the time. Well, they need a healthy, biodiverse environment in order to survive. So there's a lot of benefits to biodiversity that we maybe don't think about on the surface. So we've hit all the main objectives. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of a boost to prepare for that content assessment. But don't forget that you've got a lot of other resources in the platform that you can also access if you need it.